Hello and welcome to English 416C, American independent film at the end of the 20th century. I'll be your instructor, Dr. Sam Lackey. I've had most of you for a class before, so I look forward to working with you again. For those of you who have not taken me before, I look forward to getting to know you this semester. So this is the introduction, the introductory lecture that I'm posting here in week one, just to kind of give you guys an overview of the class. We can talk a little bit about our schedule, our workload, sort of how the class is going to work. And I also wanted to provide some introductory material just about general film terms, a little glossary that I've posted in the week one module. I wanted to talk about that a little bit and also just get into some general history and background, just some information that I think you guys might need. You might find it helpful over the course of the semester as we start to study our films. So to start, I just wanted to address the fact that we are watching movies in this class, even though it is listed as an English class. You might be wondering why. I'm assuming most of you are movie fans, otherwise you probably would not have signed up for the class. But I do realize that for many of us, this might be the first time that we are really studying film in an academic way, in an academic context. So for those of you who have never taken a film class before, or an English class that is devoted to film like this one, if you've never taken one like that before, don't worry. Part of what I want to do here in week one is just to kind of provide some terminology, a little bit of language, and like I said, a little bit of background info that will get you guys kind of up to speed and maybe give you a chance to explore a few visual or specifically cinematic elements of the movies that we are going to be watching. But of course, this is not a film studies class, so I don't expect you guys to have a high level of expertise about the technical side of movie making. I would like to talk about some technical aspects and again, get into a little bit of the visual side. And I can try to help with that. But you guys can also really approach a lot of these movies much like you have approached literature in previous English classes. So that's really one of the main reasons why we can do film in an English class, because a lot of the critical skills that you've already learned, the analytical skills that you've picked up in previous lit classes, that stuff will come in handy when you're studying film, as you're going to see. And as you can probably already imagine, if you've never really studied film in school, you can see how we can use a lot of our literary analysis skills to study film. Obviously, we're still dealing with narratives, we're still dealing with stories, and a lot of the literary elements that we are all familiar with, that we've worked with in the past, stuff like character, setting, theme, plot, even some elements like symbolism or figurative language. We can find examples of all of that stuff in movies. So that's why there should be a lot of sort of familiarity for those of you, even those who have not really done film before, because you can still search for those same kinds of elements in the movies. You can talk about characters, talk about setting. You can obviously and should often address thematic material, the larger message, the larger meaning. But there's also going to be language analysis that we can conduct, just like we would with a short story or a novel or a poem. Obviously, with movies, we're not reading very often, although we can in certain instances, but we are still listening to language. We still have examples of dialogue. We can certainly be interested in a screenplay. We can look at a script. We can do a little bit more analysis of the actual writing that goes into these movies, because they all have that component. So we can do a lot of the same work that we would typically do in a lit class that we've all done before, hunting for those same elements and analyzing them in some of the same ways that we've done before, or at least similar ways. But we also need to acknowledge that movies are different from novels, short stories, poems, plays, right? So we have to navigate some of the uniquely cinematic elements that go along with film. So that's a little bit of what I want to do today. I mentioned that glossary of film terms that I posted in the week 1 module. We'll get to that momentarily. I'll just cover a few important terms, a few important sort of job functions or job roles, job titles that relate to movie making that we need to know. And I'll also give you a little brief history just so we can understand what independent film is, how we define it, and how it often gets discussed. But before we get into that, let's just sort of go over some basics. If you guys are in Web Campus right now, or if you can open a new browser, you might just want to check out the syllabus. I've already posted that in the week 1 module. You might want to download that file. Just keep it handy. The most important stuff, the most important information in the syllabus, and you know this if you've taken me for a previous class, is the detailed course schedule. And I always include these in my syllabi. If you go down near the end, like the final 2 or 3 pages of the document, you should see the schedule. And that's really the most important thing to hang on to or bookmark, because I'm telling you what we are doing each week of the semester. So I'm telling you all the films that we are watching. You can see the order in which we are watching them. You can see when our assignments are due. We don't have a ton of different assignments. We have weekly discussion posts. That should feel familiar. We also have 3 what I'm calling short analytical responses. So I've abbreviated those as SARs. We have 3 of those over the course of the semester. We can talk a little bit more about those. Each one's a little bit different, but they're all the same type of length, short response papers that give you a chance to practice some of the concepts that we've been discussing in class. And then, of course, we have a final paper, a big paper due at the end of the semester. Our seminar paper, we're obviously going to spend a lot of time on that. No tests. Hopefully we don't feel the need. I won't feel the need to do any reading quizzes. I don't really like to do that kind of stuff at this level. It should really just be the writing assignments, the weekly posts, give us a chance to sort of discuss, talk to one another, sort of simulate an in-class discussion. The short response papers, again, are just largely practice. Chance for you to work on some of these skills, but I want them to be polished. And then that big final paper, we'll have plenty of time to talk about that one later. So if you look in the syllabus, you should see descriptions of all of the assignments. You can see how many points each one is worth. And then if you look at the schedule, you'll be able to see when everything is due. And again, a lot of you have taken me for classes before, so you know that I like to sort of operate on basically the same schedule every week. Monday morning, I will publish that week's module. That will include an overview, sort of a summary of what we're covering that week. And this is all, of course, in the weekly modules in Web Campus. And I like to do a little overview each week, a summary of the film, a little bit of biographical information about the director of the film, and just anything else that I think is important. I'm not going to include my lecture notes, but I will mention some stuff that also gets talked about in lecture, but also I'll include some information that maybe I did not get to in lecture. So the overview is worth reading. I'll also post the movie for that week. I'll remind you what we are watching. If we have a reading assignment from our one required book, I will post that as well. And if any assignment is due at the end of that week, I will let you know. So there'll always be a link to that week's discussion board. And also, if an SAR is due or something else near the end of the semester, I'll of course have links to those as well, along with descriptions of the assignments. You'll always be able to find those in the module. So most of you are experienced students. You've been doing this for a long time, so you know. Just check out that week's module at the beginning of each week. You don't have to do it Monday morning necessarily, but that is when the modules will be available. And by the end of that week, you need to complete the work that's due for that week, whether it's just a discussion post or, again, if there's an additional assignment. You'll need to get it done by Sunday night at midnight. That's when the week ends. And then, of course, a new week begins first thing the following Monday morning. So just get used to that schedule. We do have those weekly discussion posts, and there will usually be a reading assignment. And the one book that I would like you guys to purchase for the class is pictured here. I've ordered it through the bookstore. The author is John Pearson. So you can get the book through the GBC bookstore if you'd like. You can also order it online without involving GBC. That's fine too. But just make sure to get the book soon if you don't have it already. You can find used copies online. This book is not hard to find. It's been around for a while. Was published in the 90s. And we'll talk a little bit more about Pearson as we go. He's a pretty good guide for the historical time period that we are covering in this class. The book is useful. We're not going to use it a ton. Like I said, most weeks I will want you to read a chapter from the book, but not every week. We will take some weeks off from Pearson. We do need a break from him from time to time. He can be a little bit of a gossipy kind of insider, but that is kind of the perspective that he offers. He kind of worked in the film industry for a long time. In particular, he was sort of on the distribution side of filmmaking, and we'll talk about what that means in a moment. But he basically was a middleman who helped to sort of connect young up-and-coming independent filmmakers with major Hollywood studios and big distribution companies that could distribute the young directors' movies, basically, is kind of what Pearson did. So he established personal relationships with several of the filmmakers that we're going to be studying this semester. And you're going to learn about that in the chapters. He knew Spike Lee. He had a relationship with Kevin Smith. They were friends. They became friends. He knows Jim Jarmusch, a lot of these other figures that we're going to be talking about. So he offers an interesting perspective in that way. He sheds some light on a lot of the sort of business dealings, sort of the business side of filmmaking, because of course we have to acknowledge that while movies are art, unquestionably, they are also business. They are big business, and Pearson kind of shows us a little bit of the business side. We might not be as interested in that, but his chapters are still pretty useful, especially his first two chapters. And I want you guys to read those this week. So I won't normally ask you to read multiple chapters in a week, but I would like you to do that if you have time here in week one. If you're not getting the book until later in the week, it's not a big deal if you're still finishing up the reading next week. But the first chapter is really just sort of a history, a little bit of context that he provides. And I think that's a really good chapter for us here at the beginning, just to kind of understand the roots of independent film in this country, sort of what it is and where it came from. He'll help us with that. And then we can also read the chapter about Jarmusch, who is our first filmmaker. He's directing the first film that we watch. So, we can use Pearson. We're not going to use him all the time, and we can certainly have some criticisms of him. I mean, part of why this book is interesting, I think, is it's kind of an artifact of 90s culture. It kind of reflects, I would argue, certain worldviews and perspectives that are a bit out of fashion now, and we don't necessarily share them with Pearson in certain cases. So that's something we can talk about, and we need to talk about certain aspects of independent film in the 90s that were a little bit unsavory. And we're going to talk about Miramax. We're going to talk about Harvey Weinstein, unfortunately. Kind of have to, because he was a very important figure in independent filmmaking in the 90s. He helped produce and get a lot of important American indie films made through his studio, Miramax. And Miramax sort of plays an important role as an entity, sort of illustrating big developments and changes in American filmmaking during that time. So we'll get to all of that, but there is some stuff we're going to have to sort of reckon with and wrestle with that might be a little uncomfortable or unpleasant at times, and Pearson will give us a chance to do that as well, for better or worse. So try to get that book if you haven't already. That's the only required book. And of course, the only other requirement in terms of materials, stuff that you're going to have to acquire or buy, the only other thing will be, of course, the films themselves. So I do want to just say a word about that here quickly before we get into our true introductory material. I'm going to sort of leave it up to you guys to watch these films on your own. I tried to do screenings with a previous 416 class. It didn't really work. We had some tech issues, but by and large, most people just did not want to have to sit down at a set time and watch the movies, with other people. And I sort of get that this is an asynchronous online class. So we might not be thrilled with the idea of having to get together at a set time each week and watch a film. However, if you guys want to do that, this is a small class. There's only about 7 or 8 of us. So if you guys want to do weekly screenings, I would like that. Traditional film classes, we would do that if we were meeting in person. But it's totally up to you guys. It's not about my preferences. It's really about what works best for you guys. So if you want to do screenings, we will. I will try to find a way to make it happen. If you guys don't care and don't want to, that's fine too. You can just watch them individually on your own. But unfortunately, you are going to have to buy the majority of these movies. There are a lot of different avenues for you to do that, and most of them can be bought for a very, small amount of money. And they're all available. I've double checked to make sure that all 14 films on our schedule are available to watch online. So you have a few options, and if you want, I can give you more info. I can sort of tell you where to look for each individual film, but I assume you guys are pretty savvy and you guys know how to watch stuff online, so you probably don't need my help, but if you do, feel free to ask and I can always provide more info. But between YouTube, Criterion, the Criterion channel, which is something you have to buy a subscription to if you want to be able to watch films there, but some of these films are available on that website and you could watch them with a subscription. A lot of them are available on YouTube. You should probably be able to find a good number of them through Amazon or maybe Amazon Prime. And there might be one other venue. I'll double check. But between those platforms or services, you should be able to acquire all of these films. A lot of them you can just buy them on YouTube or you can rent them, and typically it is cheaper to rent. So a lot of them might be available for like $2.99 or $3.99 to rent. Now you only have about a 48-hour viewing period from the time that you make the purchase. So if you're just renting, make sure you watch the film soon. Because it's going to expire after 2 days, and then you've kind of wasted the money. But if you pay more money to buy the film, then of course you can watch it whenever you want, and you can also rewatch it, which will be useful at least when it comes to writing about the films. It might be a good idea to purchase at least a couple, purchase the ones that you think you might want to return to and write about later. Because it's just like writing about a novel. You really want to have that novel by your side as you're writing your paper so you can flip through it, find passages, find examples, do some real close textual engagement kind of stuff. It's the same with a movie. You want to be able to, pull up that movie and at least rewatch individual scenes. You might not rewatch the whole thing, but you want to be able to go back and find a critical, exchange of dialogue or a really important dramatic scene that you want to break down. So it can be good to just have some of these movies so you can pull them up, rewatch parts whenever you want. But if it's a movie that, you're probably not going to write about and you just need to watch it so you can do that week's discussion post and keep up, then yeah, renting is probably fine in those cases. So just let me know if you have any questions or if you have any issues acquiring these films. Just let me know. Something you might want to do here in week 1 is just go ahead and get them all, or at least get some of them, or just kind of figure out how you're going to watch these movies. Again, start searching. If you already have an Amazon subscription, start there and see what you can watch already with that subscription. That goes with any of those other platforms. Again, Criterion, I can understand if you guys don't want to buy a subscription to that, but they have a lot of cool movies, and you can watch some of these on that website as well. So just kind of figure it out for yourselves, figure out what makes the most sense for you financially, in terms of convenience, in terms of what streaming services you already have, and if you have questions or concerns, just let me know. But we are watching a movie each week, so it's important that you have access to all of them. But I assume that it probably won't be very difficult. Again, I've double checked. These are all available between the various services I mentioned. Netflix, I don't know. You can probably find a few. I haven't really looked on Netflix. I don't have a Netflix subscription anymore. You might be able to find a few there, but I think what you really want would be YouTube, Amazon, and Criterion. And there might be some other venues. And if any of you have more information, or if you have other services or sites that you use where some of these movies are, you can make that announcement to the whole class, or you can just email me and I'll make that information available to the entire class. So get in touch with me if you want to talk more about finding and acquiring the films. Otherwise, we'll just do it. But again, if you guys want to email me here in week 1 with your preferences about movie screenings, if you want them, you can say so. If you don't want them, or if you yourself don't want to participate, that's fine. Because even if we do screenings, they will never be mandatory. They'll always be optional. But I would like to have some sense of what we want and how many people would even want to show up to a screening. Because if it's only like 1 or 2 of you, we probably won't do it. But if it's like 4 or 5 of you, then we certainly could. And I would certainly enjoy doing it. So just let me know. I can go either way. So that's pretty much it. Just take a look at the syllabus. Take a look at the modules. If you have any questions, let me know, and we can talk further. I'm easy to contact. Again, most of you know me. You can always email me. I'm pretty prompt with emails. I can usually respond within 24 hours. That's the best way to find me. If you want to talk on the phone for some reason, you can do that on Mondays. I am in the office in Winnemucca on Mondays, but that's typically the only day that I'll be around for an extended phone conversation. So email's usually best, and we can always set up video conferences through Zoom as well, if you guys want to do that. And in fact, I think I'm going to make everybody do that towards the end of the semester before our final paper, but we can always do it multiple times if you want to talk more about anything. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit now about independent film. What is it? Why do we care about it? How do we define it? So let's start by just defining the term so we can all sort of work with the same basic concept and definition here. So generally speaking, we can define an independent film as any film made outside the major Hollywood studios. So let's talk a little bit about the Hollywood studios and the sort of Hollywood machine that many of us are already somewhat familiar with. So again, I assume most of you like movies and watch movies. Even if you don't, even people who don't know very much about movies, they know Hollywood, right? We use that term, we hear that term all the time. It does a lot of interesting work. We're not going to plumb the depths of it right now, but we use Hollywood as a stand-in sometimes for the entire entertainment industry. More specifically, we use that term as a stand-in for the movie industry. Right? So it's both a geographical location. There is literally a Hollywood. That's where a lot of the studios are located, in Los Angeles. So a lot of the studio lots are. A lot of movies get shot there. A lot of, people involved in the film industry live in that greater area, or in LA at least. So we kind of know that. We know it's this sort of hub of American movie making. But when we use it sort of in this class, when talking about independent film, we're really using Hollywood to kind of represent the studios. And the golden age of American cinema really kind of coincides with the golden age of the big studio system that used to dominate American film. So prior to the 1960s, there really weren't very many independent film productions in America. And the reason was because the studios largely controlled everything. The studios, beginning around the 1920s, as we were sort of transitioning from silent film to sound, beginning around there, kind of early on in sort of film history and extending all the way up to the 1960s. That's often referred to as the golden age of Hollywood. And during that roughly 40-year period or so, there were 8 major studios that pretty much controlled all aspect of filmmaking in America. And some of those studios still exist today. So the big 8, as they existed back then, were as follows. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, that was one. Paramount, still around, that was another. Warner Brothers, 20th Century Fox, RKO, Universal, Columbia, and United Artists. I think over half of those still exist in some form or another today. Of course, there's been lots of corporate mergers, lots of changes in terms of the business happenings, but just important to keep in mind that while the traditional studio system is over, a lot of those big studios never went away. And the big studios still control a lot. But things started to change after World War II. So the US government started to notice that the studios in Hollywood were really kind of functioning a lot like, drug cartels or monopolies. They were sort of squeezing out the competition. They were making it very difficult for anybody outside of the studio system to ever make any movies. So eventually the US, I think the Senate, decided to pass these antitrust laws that were designed to break up monopolies. And those started to really hurt the studios. So the process of weakening the studios really began in the late 1940s. Right after World War II ended. But other things happened to kind of accelerate the change. So in the 1950s, television really takes off as another sort of dominant form of popular culture and media. And it starts to siphon off a lot of movie business because a lot of people are just staying home and watching TV, maybe not going out to the movie theaters as much. So that was a part of it, and really by the 1960s, the old days of studio dominance were really coming to an end, and we have all this change and innovation, a lot of change in the 60s, culturally, and also in terms of, a lot of art and a lot of movie changes that we can sort of chart as well. So it was a slow process, but by the late 60s, that golden age was over, and the studios did not have quite as much power as they previously did. So that kind of opened things up. That made it more possible for young indie filmmakers with no connections, with no studio contract, to make movies. You start having new companies spring up. And Pearson talks about this a little bit in the first chapter of the book. You have new production companies, new distribution companies, new people getting involved in the business, new voices, new perspectives, and things start to open up and change in the late 60s and then throughout the 70s and 80s. And that's where we come in, because by the 1980s, we finally have a sort of coherent, robust American independent film scene and movement. And that's kind of where we start our own tour through this history. So again, the first chapter of the book is kind of helpful to understanding some of that. But just before we get into more of that, let me just mention the 3 stages of film, basically the film industry, just so you can understand how the studios used to control all 3. So typically we can break down the overall process of a movie getting made and getting shown to the masses. We can break it down into 3 basic stages. And back in the golden age, the studios had what was called vertical integration. So they controlled all 3 of these levels, all 3 stages of film making and the process of people actually going and watching film. So the first stage is production. So in its most simple sense, this is the actual making of the movie. We can get a little bit more specific and talk about pre-production, like that's when the screenplay is maybe getting written, they're scouting locations, they're casting actors, but we can also roll it all together. There's also post-production, everything that gets done after principal photography or after the shooting of the film, right? Then you have the editing. You have to add special effects, other visual effects, music. All of that stuff gets done during what's called post-production. So really we have pre-production, then we have principal photography. That's when we're actually shooting the movie on location or on some set in Hollywood, and then we have post-production, which comes later, but we can roll all that in together and call it production. That's stage 1. Okay, stage 2 is distribution, and this is the process by which a film is bought. Somebody has to acquire the rights to the film and then make it available to audiences by selling it to theaters or other exhibition outlets. So we're going to learn a little bit more about this through the book, because Pearson is very much involved in distribution. He works for a couple of different distribution companies. He doesn't get in on the creative side of filmmaking. He gets in more on the business side after film school. So again, he's helping independent filmmakers to sell their films, or in some cases, he's trying to buy their films on behalf of the production company that he works for. The distribution company that he works for. So distribution companies would sometimes just be an arm of a larger studio, right? In other cases, and as we're going to see, this is one of the big changes that occur over time. More and more sort of independent distribution companies spring up, and they're able to sort of find raw talent out there and help them get discovered by buying their film and then selling the film to theaters or other places that can show it. So that brings us to the third and final stage, which is exhibition. So we have production, distribution, and then exhibition. And exhibition just means the literal showing of the film. So in the days before home video, in the days before streaming, obviously movie theaters were pretty much the only show in town. If you were going to go and watch a movie, you would have to go to a theater, pay your money, get some popcorn, go sit down and watch it. But in the old days, a lot of the studios, a lot of those big studios that I listed, obviously they controlled production. They also controlled distribution. And in some cases, they even owned the movie theaters. They would even own a lot of the theaters where the films were actually shown. And in the cases where they didn't own the theaters, they would just sort of sell their films to the theaters using this method that was called block booking. And they would sort of force the theater to buy a whole bunch of their movies sight unseen, because the theaters were kind of reliant on the studios to supply them with the movies that they were going to show. So even when the studios didn't own the theaters, they could sort of bully the theaters or the theater owners into doing what they wanted, buying what they wanted them to buy. So again, this was vertical integration. This was how the studios controlled all aspects of filmmaking from the very beginning, when the film was still in its sort of conceptual stages, all the way to that film being shown in theaters. But again, this is not really legal for businesses to sort of monopolize an industry the way they were. So they were eventually weakened by antitrust legislation, also television, and several other modernizations and changes that were occurring in the post-war years over the course of the 50s and 60s. So like Pearson says, a real American independent film movement kind of begins in the 60s, when you have this guy named John Cassavetes. And some of you might be a little bit familiar with him. He was a pretty well-known Hollywood actor who used a lot of the money he made as an actor to finance his own film productions. And he's often called sort of the father or the grandfather of American independent cinema, because he was able to operate outside of the studios. He eventually created his own distribution company, and he was also producing the movies independently. So he was able to kind of bypass the big studios, and he could sort of manage the movies himself. Now, of course, what we have to realize about Cassavetes is he was using his role as a Hollywood actor working for the studios, of course, to finance his independent movies. So some people say, well, maybe it's not quite accurate to call him a true father of independent cinema, but it depends on your perspective. He might have just been, resourceful. I don't know, but he appeared in some pretty big movies during the 60s and into the 70s. He was in The Dirty Dozen, if any of you like that. Maybe some of your dads like that one. Rosemary's Baby, he was in that film as well. So a well-known actor, and again, he starts making these independent productions beginning in 1960 with a film called Shadows. So at one point, he was recruited by Paramount to make sort of low-budget artistic films. But again, it was going to be within the studio system, and he didn't like that. He wanted more freedom. So with the money that he had as a successful character actor, he set up his own distribution company, right? So he was able to own his own films. And this is a really important concept that I don't think a lot of casual film viewers think about very much, but the idea of owning your own film. Other filmmakers talk about that in the book, in Pearson's book. Spike Lee talks about it. This idea of not having to sell your movie to the highest bidder, not having to sell it to a studio or a distribution company that would then step in and sort of handle the rest. To be able to own your own film, distribute your own film, sort of control how it gets marketed. You can control how it gets exhibited, right? How it gets shown. That's a level of control that Cassavetes was able to have in the 60s. And, he was a big influence on future generations of American indie filmmakers. So in chapter 1 of Pearson's book, he's talking about the New York City independent film underground as it existed back in the 70s in the 80s when he was kind of young and, fresh out of film school and living in lower Manhattan and sort of participating in this culture. But it's an interesting, sort of snapshot of a particular time and place, and it comes in handy for us because that's the same world that Jim Jarmusch inhabited, and Jarmusch directed Stranger Than Paradise, which is our first film. That's what we're watching here in week one. So again, Pearson knows Jarmusch. They kind of traveled in similar circles. So he can shed some light on kind of where Jarmusch is coming from. But another thing Pearson talks about is the sort of independent movie theaters or repertory theaters that used to be very common in big cities like New York. And this is interesting because it's kind of a relic of a previous time. And again, Pearson, after film school, I think, really starts working on the exhibition side initially. He's working for movie theaters, and then I think later he gets more into distribution. But he talks about these indie theaters, right? They're privately owned. They're not owned by studios. They're not showing big budget, major American studio films. These are sort of art house theaters. They're often showing art movies. They're showing films from Europe. They're showing some of these burgeoning independent productions that are made outside of the studios. They're often a little bit avant-garde, a little bit strange, at least to a mainstream audience. They're expressing different viewpoints, different perspectives, often made on a very low budget, like many of the films that we're going to be watching this semester. So there's kind of a DIY attitude, and we'll talk about that more when we talk about Stranger Than Paradise. Right, so Pearson is very much in on sort of the ground floor of these sort of early days of American independent film. And these theaters were really important because a lot of these indie films were getting shown in these independent theaters, these art house theaters, repertory theaters. They have a lot of different names, but they all kind of mean the same thing. And again, they're privately owned. They were often small, and a lot of them are gone now. You can still find some. You can still find independent theaters. Again, most of them are in large urban centers. So New York City, LA, Chicago, big cities have them. When I was in college, the sort of medium-sized southern city where I lived had one independent theater. It's gone now, but back in the early 2000s, it still existed. It had 2 screens. It was very, very small, but it was a place to go and watch independent film, foreign films, stuff that you wouldn't be able to see in the multiplex. So Pearson's really talking about, again, sort of a bygone era before the multiplex took over. The multiplex just means one of those big movie theaters with a whole bunch of screens that you often find in like malls, or like big shopping centers. And that's where most people watch movies now. But Pearson's talking about, if they go to the movies at all, it's going to probably be at the multiplex. But Pearson's talking about an earlier period where, there were a lot of different places to go and watch different kinds of films. But also he's narrating the early days of a lot of independent film production. Because now, once we're in the 70s and then into the 80s, the industry has just opened up. The studios are still there. There's several big studios that still make the lion's share of the profitable movies in America, but there's more avenues. There's smaller companies that are coming up. There's more opportunities for young people and relatively inexperienced people like Pearson to make movies, but also there's new distribution companies getting set up, new production companies. In some cases, they're doing production and distribution, but they're outside of Hollywood. They're outside of that studio system. So this is a more diverse, kind of wide open side of movie making that's really beginning to emerge over the course of, again, the late 60s, 70s, and then we pick things up in the 80s. So, along with Cassavetes, there were 2 other Johns. I think Pearson mentions at one point that they're sometimes called the 3 Johns. 2 other really important sort of early American independent filmmakers, John Sayles and John Waters. So Sales was a little bit like Cassavetes in that he worked within the Hollywood system, used the money he made to finance his own films. I think he set up his own distribution company like Cassavetes did. Sales was a screenwriter, and he wrote some pretty big, pretty profitable Hollywood films. He did, I don't know actually any of those off the top of my head, but I know some of his own films, Secaucus 7, Lone Star. So he started financing his own stuff, owned his own films. They were often kind of political in nature. But Sales kind of rose to prominence in the late 90s. Lone Star was maybe his biggest hit that had a young Matthew McConaughey in it. And he's continued to make movies into the 2000s. And then John Waters is the third John. You might know him. He did Pink Flamingos, Hairspray. And Waters is a really good example of a truly independent filmmaker. He never worked within Hollywood. He was completely outside of traditional movie making. He raised his own money. He shot all of his films in his hometown of Baltimore, Maryland, which is also where Pearson's from. So Pearson kind of has a soft spot for Waters. But again, Waters really was that sort of do-it-yourself kind of filmmaker. Raised his own money, took care of distribution, sold his stuff to exhibition outlets. They were filmed on very small budgets, but eventually he got noticed. And this is a trajectory that we're going to see with a lot of other independent filmmakers. They start out small. They find some success, at least critical success, even if their movies don't make a whole lot of money. They might find critical success. Their name gets out there. And then what happens? The big studios swoop in, offer them a big contract, say, hey, why don't you come and make a movie for us? We'll give you a big budget. We'll give you a lot of creative control. And then the indie filmmaker kind of ceases to be indie. That even happened with John Waters, who's a very strange and idiosyncratic filmmaker, but he ends up making a big budget film, I believe in 1990, called Crybaby with a young Johnny Depp. Wasn't as successful as maybe the studio hoped, but this is a trajectory that we're going to notice with a lot of the filmmakers that we study. And that's why nowadays some people will argue that there's not really a lot of truly independent filmmaking in America, because even if you have an independent production, right, meaning the production stage of the movie making is done outside the studio system without studio money, even if that's the case, a lot of those movies are ultimately sold to studios, or they're sold to arms or subsidiaries of big studios who then can distribute the film and take care of the rest. Or in other cases, those films might, be distributed independently, but then by the exhibition stage, maybe something else has happened. I mean, the point is, it's hard to stay independent all the way. If you want to get your movie widely released, if you want it to be accessible for a wide audience, at some point, you're probably going to need to make a deal with the company that has some money. And a lot of those companies are, in one way or another, sort of affiliated with the larger Hollywood studio system, which again still exists. It's just not quite the monopoly that it used to be. Okay, so I think that's probably enough for our historical background. I want to come back in part 2 of the introduction and go through that glossary very quickly. Just talk about some of these key terms so we have a little bit more of a vocabulary that we can use when we start to analyze film.